Everyone. My name is Steven, and before I kind of begin talking over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I just want to express my sincerest gratitude and appreciation to Andre and the Young Grappa organization for the invitation today. This is my first time kind of doing something like this, so I hope that everyone can take at least one thing out of my presentation today. So a little bit about me. I'm a medical lab scientist by training. I've worked in the clinical lab for a few years before transitioning to my PhD with Dr. Eder and Dr. Chandran in Toronto, Canada. And much of my work is utilizing translational methods and doing translational studies to investigate the biological mechanisms that drive sex differences in those with psoriatic arthritis. So the grant I'm talking about today will be a translational study. But here are some examples of grants that I've
Just
received in the
quick
past.
interrupting you, Steven, sorry.
Sure, yeah.
Uh, just saying that now Wilson Liao and Lee Eder are here, and we are fixing the issues with the tenants joining with now Vinod Chandran as well as online. So welcome, everyone. I'm glad that we finally made it after a few hiccups. Uh, sorry to cut your flow. You may continue, Steven.
I'll try. But thank you. Yeah, welcome. But yeah, here are some examples of some of the grants and scholarships that I've won. But I'm not necessarily here to brag about those, but more so to highlight that I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have received these grants if it weren't for the journey of rejection and failures on my part. So here are some examples of grants and awards that I've not received. And the peer review feedback from my supervisors have been so key in essentially allowing me to learn and improve such that I can eventually win these awards listed here. So you have to be stubborn, you have to be persistent, and maybe develop a little bit of thicker skin, but at the end of the day, you just need that one win and things will start to roll. So today I'll be talking about my translational project, Sex Differences in Psoriatic Arthritis through Imaging Mass Cytometry of Synovial Tissue. And this can be found on the GRAPPA website in the here in the research section in the Pilot Research Grant 2025. If you are interested in taking a look at the 2023 pilot grant, you can just probably search it up in the GRAPPA search bar, but you can definitely find it through a Google search. And for those that are kind of starting off and writing grants or you don't know where to start, what I did was look at the previous grants and kind of see what, other people have done. And that was a good starting point for me. And I'd like to highlight three resources that have been very instrumental, four resources that have been very instrumental for me. These three books, The Craft of Research, Style, and Story Not Study. I've picked these three books up when I first started graduate school, and I continue to use it to this day. And in fact, when I write my manuscripts or grants or proposals, I have an iPad in front of me with one of these three resources and kind of just learn something from them every single time. It's a bit of it does take a bit of time, but if you want to improve, you got to put in that time. And I assume everyone here is somewhat affiliated with a university. And of course, universities all have writing centers. So I strongly advise you all to have a one-on-one with a writing specialist or attend the webinars or classes. For instance, at the University of Toronto, they have a writing, revising, pre-writing course, oral presentations, and sometimes they have courses to write to specific scholarships. All right, so let's kind of dive into things here. I'm not going to go sentence by sentence and critiquing all the sentences and grammar, but kind of give you a broad overview and kind of my mindset when I was writing my pilot grant. So with the GRAPPA pilot grant, you're required to write a scientific and lay abstract. And I assume a lot of people here are going to be writing their abstracts last, and that's what I did. But how I structured it, I started broad, talking about, psoriatic arthritis. And you can start to see a little bit of a trend here. You want to identify the gap, of course, objective hypothesis, discuss the methods, and then finish off with the impact statement. Now, the lay abstract is anything lay related is a skill in of itself, right? I'm sure everyone here is very used to writing scientifically, using large jargon words and technical terms. But when it comes to writing lay, you have to be able to write it in a way that the public can understand your project. And it takes time. And certainly my lay abstract is not perfect. And actually preparing for this webinar, this lay abstract could be significantly improved on. But Both abstracts ultimately address the problem you plan to focus on, why the audience should care, how will you conduct your research, and the impact your work will have if you receive the grant. And you can start to see differences again, right? The scientific abstract, when I start broad, it's 1.5 sentences, and the lay abstract, one quick, no, 15 words or so, less than 15 words. When I identify the gap, it's about 2 sentences. In the lay abstract, the reasons for these differences are not well understood. That's it. So it does take a bit of time to kind of craft this. If anything, writing the lay is much harder than writing the scientific abstract, but it just takes some practice. And a little bit of the lay. Again, the whole purpose is to highlight the relevance of your research in an accessible, easy to read format. You're wanting to raise awareness and you want to be able to explain your research with minimal background, perhaps in science, medicine, and certainly in your area. So if you're applying for a big scholarship, chances are they're going to want to publish your work on the website. And more often than not, they're going to request a lay abstract, lay summary, lay significance, and you're going to have to write that, and it takes a bit of time. So some kind of tips when writing lay, you want a strong hook, right? This is where you kind of want to be creative here. You want to discuss application and benefits. How is it relevant to the patient that's perhaps reading this? Keep sentences short, clear, and focused, and definitely avoid jargon and technical terms. And of course, get your non-scientist friends or non-medical friends to read. If technically you're supposed, if you were to pull someone off the streets, they should be able to read and understand your lay section. So then my abstract was about half a page or so. Then I transitioned to talking about the background and rationale. Again, I started broad, then narrow. This is where you bring in what you know, that your literature review, essentially, a very condensed literature review. And you really want to highlight what the gap is and ultimately why does it matter. So in my case, biological mechanisms behind sex-based differences are unclear. Great. Posing challenges for the accurate diagnosis and treatment. So that's why it matters. And then I transition talking about sex hormones and the receptors. So of course, with any paragraph, you want to start with a nice topic sentence. And this is where you want to start to provide additional research context, right? What do we know about it in the healthy population? What do we know about it in other rheumatic conditions? What do we know about it in PSA? And within the background rationale, this is where you want to start using your bolding or your italices strategically. You don't want to overuse it, but you want to use it strategically. And how I did it was bolding anything that was highlighting that, hey, this is unexplored in PSA, right? Despite these insights, exact roles in PSA remain largely unexplored, warranting further investigation. And one tip I have when it comes to writing this, because the background rationale can be 2-3 pages by itself, right? And what I recommend is write those 2 to 3 pages, but then start to trim it down. And that's exactly what I did. For instance, in this rheumatoid arthritis sentence, right, there's a lot of information about estrogen, androgen, progesterone in rheumatoid arthritis. I wrote in my earlier drafts 3 pages about that. And I just trimmed it down at the end of it. It takes a lot of time, but it's a good way to also learn about your area if you're new. I then transitioned talking about the technology I'm using, imaging mass cytometry. That was in the title of my project and my proposal. So I was trying to anticipate the reviewer's silent question. Why am I using this method? So what was done before? Single cell analysis, IHC. And here's one of the mistakes that I've noticed after going through it. I never actually defined what IHC was, immunohistochemistry. What is missing? Well, we're dissociating tissue, losing the spatially defined niches. IHC, low multiplexing and resolution. What does IMC add? What does your technology add? And why does this matter biologically? So when you're editing your proposal, you should be able to highlight sections and you'll start to see a pattern. You start to see a flow. You don't want to jump too much around because that's going to confuse the reader. And then you want to cap it off. So this is, again, my background and rationale. So I combined, if you haven't noticed already, how I structured my paragraphs. I start with what we know, and then I highlighted what we don't know. So then I finish off by saying, hey, the role of sex hormones, sex steroid receptors, biological mechanisms, spatial organizations. We don't know any of this for PSA synovial inflammation in the context of looking at sex differences. So then I finish off with a very strong, bolded statement that investigating these could help identify sex-specific markers and the development of therapeutic strategies, trying to hit this home. Then I transitioned to, of course, objective and hypothesis. So I feel like this is pretty straightforward. You know, you can organize this however you like. In fact, if you look at the previous pilot grants, everyone has their own way of structuring this, and they're all perfectly acceptable, and they all look great. Um, because this is a pilot grant, you want to be realistic and really specific with your aims. Right? You also have to be, you have to consider that you can't have, you know, six aims and expect to complete it within the year, right? So in this case, you in this pilot grant and other pilot grants, you might see 1 to 3 aims, and they should be independent of each other. And then preliminary data. So not everyone's going to have this, but if you do have it, if you have a previous publication or even a literature review, it can absolutely strengthen your proposal and it can demonstrate viability as well. But I understand that because it's a pilot grant, this project may actually be your preliminary data for a larger grant, and that's perfectly okay too. In my case, we successfully applied imaging mass cytometry to map immune cell populations in synovial tissue, and that was published. So that shows to the reviewer that, hey, our team can do this. We have done this before, and it is feasible, it is viable. And validation is also very important. In translational studies and biomarker studies, validation is something that's not often done. And when you validate something, that is a huge bonus. So I'm following up on my results from my previous GRAPPA study. Methods is the next section. Again, this is one's a bit tricky because you can easily be very technical here and you can overwhelm the reader. So you want to be very mindful not to leave big blocks of text. So how you organize your grant is incredibly important. So if you actually look at my grant, it's not a one flow. I have figures that kind of change the organization, makes it a little bit more interesting. So discuss where your patient cohort came from. Do you have a database or a biobank? Are you recruiting patients? You have to be mindful that if you're recruiting 100 patients, is that possible in a short amount of time as well? Um, I discussed antibodies and using a published pipeline, so I'm increasing technical feasibility in that way. If you've done a power analysis, it's probably best that you show it here. And then in terms of your statistical analysis, of course, you really want to make clear how your statistical analysis will address your aims that you mentioned before. Again, how I did it was just by bulleting it. Other people have done it through lists, bullet points, all perfectly okay. You just got to be mindful that that is very clear to the reviewer that your methods and your data analysis will address the aims that you proposed. And then to cap it all off, your significance, right? You want to describe the expected outcomes and what the potential impacts might be. What are the short and long-term impacts that are tangible to people living with arthritis? So you really want to, again, hit home with this one. Why is your study so important? Why should GRAPPA be funding you to do something like this? And then there's other components to consider as well. That's not just for the GRAPPA pilot grant, but for larger grants, right? To discuss your clinical measures or disease activity scores. Do you have them already? How are you going to collect them? Where are they stored? Sample size considerations with biomarker studies or translational methods. Sometimes it's based off of convenient sampling. You don't have that many patients or tissue samples in the first place, and that's something to consider and discuss. You can further discuss that in your limitations. How are you going to mitigate this? Knowledge translation plans. How are you going to distribute what you've worked, what your results are to the public? Involvement of patient partners is also a big one too. Um, in the 2024 pilot grant, I highly advise everyone to take a look at Dr. Aki Nakamura's pilot grant. His is a basic science research project, and he eloquently described the use of patient research partners and the significance of his research. Basic science is not basic, but he eloquently puts it in a way for everyone to understand why his work with mice is important down the line. And it's a great read. And sex and gender considerations as well is incredibly important. And feasibility and timeline. So do you have a supportive environment? Are you able to actually complete your project within the time frame? And I'm sure Dr. Eder, Dr. Chandran, the other panelists can talk more about, how to structure or how to come up with your research in general. I'd like to kind of cap off here with the inclusion of an overview figure, especially if you're doing translational methods. I like to include these because it connects the background, aims, and methods into one nice cohesive picture. So what I've done here is take the methods. How am I collecting my samples? How am I acquiring them? And what are my aims? I'm locating immune cells. I'm identifying the proportion of immune cells, relative abundance, correlation, and I'm comparing between males and females with PSA. So this is where you can get creative, and this is where it can be a little bit more fun. Um, I've listed here some resources that are free as well as paid. And here's my 2023 version. I identified the patients, I took the serum sample, sent it off to a company, 1 month turnaround, bioinformatic analysis. I'm not listing all my techniques, but I just say I'm just doing bioinformatic analysis. Then I highlight the impact here. So lastly, revising. This is the more difficult part, I would say, right? And you see the amount of drafts I had to go through. So here are some tips, right? Read your work out loud. You want to think like a reader rather than a writer. You want to leave a gap between writing the draft and editing, aka not procrastinating. And by doing this, it softens your attachment to words and phrases. And get others to peer review, especially the lay sections. And I want to finally finish my section off with 2 quotes from the Story Not Study resource that really stuck with me through the last 5 years. Sometimes the best edits begin with the courage to try a revision that deletes something you like, but that you feel in your gut doesn't belong. And just because words are edited out of the final product doesn't mean they weren't essential drivers of the process. And with that, I hope everyone, I want to thank you all for your attention. I hope over the last 16 minutes or so that you were able to take something out of it and apply it into your own writing. Thank you.
That was an excellent presentation, Stephen, very clear and walking through your steps. When you said you were going to show a little bit about of your proposal, I just imagine skipping over it in your Word document. Not such a well organized way of doing it, but even much better than what I imagined. I would like to open to the other panelists, Vinod, Wilson, and Leahy, if they would like to make any comments for now or after Dylan walks us through his way of doing things.
Uh, I think let's go. Dylan is going to be speaking more on clinical research, I suppose.
That's right, yeah.
So maybe we can have both and then we can have a discussion. Yeah.
Sounds good. Dylan,
Brilliant
up
stuff.
to
Thank
you.
you. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to chat to you this evening. It's 6:30 here in UK time, and it's great to be presenting. Tough to follow, Stephen. I haven't got some detailed slides to talk through my sort of grant writing process, but I thought, it'd be a chance to talk about sort of steps that I've taken to come to here and a little bit about myself. So I'm a trainee, rheumatology trainee and research fellow at the University of Oxford. I am currently in year 4 of 9 years, 8 years roughly of clinical training. So the overall sort of opportunities for research, at least training in the UK, is that it tends to be kind of concurrently with your clinical training. So there's opportunities to take time out of your clinical training or do alongside your clinical training. So I was successful with the pilot award in this year, 2025. And my research interests are, as Vinod had said, on the clinical side, particularly on the use of wearable technologies or digital technologies to understand better markers of treatment response, but then wider disease progression from psoriasis to psoriatic arthritis. And this has been a particular area of interest of mine since about 2018 when I approached Laura Coates with a small pilot study. And at that time, we had no grant funding. It was very much sort of beg, borrowing, and stealing with favors from different collaborators across Oxford to try and get a small scale pilot study across the line. My experience of applying to grants today, so I was unsuccessful in applying for the GRAPPA 2020 pilot grant in 2023, but actually that was my first sort of attempt at writing a grant, and the lessons learned from that process was probably the single sort of best thing in my trajectory of trying to get my own sort of small pots of money to date. So that process itself, I think lessons I learned from that. I think the research question itself that had been identified in the review from the reviewers maybe wasn't as refined. So I think that is something lesson I'd learned from this round of application was to really spend time with the research question and actually to discuss that research question with patient partners. I think that's particularly relevant on the clinical side. So anytime I was in clinic or with participants from other studies, I just would bounce the sort of research question and the overall study design and how much of an affinity sort of patients had with that particular angle. Um, then for me, the sort of single sort of biggest thing I think was a supervisor, my co-supervisor for this grant, Aidan Doherty, who is on a senior panel for one of the big funders here in the UK, and he's coming from computer science, so he sort of works on projects cross domains, so in cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and now into psoriatic disease. And for him, it was all about defining, what is the problem, what are the knowns, what are the unknowns, and then how is this research going to change the world and answer the unknowns. And that's really a rubric that he uses for papers, and that really every sort of introduction or background for every grant has to be crystallized down to that simple sort of measure. So that for me was, when I reflect back and look back on my 2023 submission, it was a sort of weaving story that didn't quite sell that can convey the need and then how this work is going to solve that problem. Um, and then in terms of sort of then specifics with writing the grant, I think Stephen, really beautifully touched on a lot of those things. It's really talking about sort of risk mitigation, I think, especially for these sort of 1 year sort of finite projects. So it's really trying to preempt the reviewing panel and think about how you will um, sort of de-risk the project to be able to deliver that project on time. So um, I think the big thing is sort of stands to reason is getting drafts down early because I think getting sort of senior supervision and getting support with the overall sort of direction of the grant is hugely helpful. And I think also if you can share your lay summaries with patient partners or patients even in clinic, that can be a really sort of helpful way to be able to crystallize down what you're saying. I think when you're on the side of the trying to deliver the research and you're um, you know, or formulate this hypothesis and get it down to a grant, I think actually sort of sharing that far and wide to make sure that it makes sense. And I think the UK here, a lot of the funders want the lay summary sort of written to a reading age of between 8 to 12. So it's really, no matter how simple you think you can go, I think it's going simpler again so that sort of everyone can understand what you're trying to achieve with the research itself. Um, I think on sort of other aspects is very much trying to think about what is the translational impact, and particularly for I'm currently in the process of sort of a cycle at the moment for a PhD fellowship here in the UK. It's all about trying to demonstrate how this will have real world impact within 5 years. So I was trying to think about the next study after that grant is funded. So thinking about that also in your final section is very helpful. And also, I think the GRAPPA, all the pilot grants are all available for the last 4 to 5 years, so that they're an excellent resource for sort of tailoring, whether it's on the clinical side, basic sciences. So I've always found those really helpful for refining the way I write the projects. Um, Beyond that, I think they were my main sort of take homes from the lessons I'd learned, sort of going from that first experience, which was unsuccessful. And I think the main thing is, requires a lot of effort and input, but I think it's just worth, it's a great experience to have a go just to submit these things because it helps you identify what the gaps are. So for me, it was that I needed to refine the question and get some more pilot data, which I was able to do in the 2 year interim to then sort of being successful with the pilot this year. But yeah, beyond that, I'd be more open to sort of questions from anyone in the audience or the panel really to help steer. Um,
Thanks, Dylan. Since you would like to answer questions, one coming to you. What advice you said, like you were able to get some pilot numbers better. Julian asked, what advice would you give when applying for a grant to run a pilot study if you cannot do a sample size calculation? Like how to go
Yeah,
over.
it's a challenge. I think trying to I think for me, the pilot, there was a lot of trying to build connections with people in different departments so that I could get a kind of minimally viable product. So I think my first pilot was 20 people. I was reusing what I use as these wearable devices, accelerometers. So I found someone in psychiatry who gave me them for free. So sometimes it's reaching out to whether that's the GRAPPA network, if it's clinical research, or people within your university network to see if there's any sort of equipment that could be used for that specific aim. Beyond that, I think just being open that this is an exploratory pilot study. Often, if you can find, particularly in psoriatic disease, there's often a lot of research in rheumatoid arthritis, and I've certainly borrowed when I'm looking at sort of physical activity as a marker of disease progression. I've used studies in rheumatoid arthritis to kind of lend some validity to the sample size that I'm trying to justify. But it's obviously different for whatever the research aim is.
Good, thank you. I'm now open to the panelists to give their input.
Yeah, and going back to the sample size question, although it's a pilot study, you do need to have a section talking about it. If you don't write there and say, you don't mention sample size, then the question of feasibility comes in, and the reviewer is already going to look at it from a negative way. So have a section like Wilson mentioned in the answer in the Q&A. You can talk to a statistician and say this is the effect size I'm looking for, and therefore with the previous studies and other places, I think this would be okay. And you give us a range of it. Or you say this is completely new, I have no idea, and this particular study is going to give us that for a larger study. Have that section there. If you don't have it, it's a big red flag.
I just want to give a shout out to both Stephen and Dylan as our outstanding, successful GRAPPA awardees this past year. It, as they've explained, it takes a lot to put in a good grant application and a lot of refinement. So kudos, and I love the concept of this seminar, which is to really share that with the community. We have three very senior um, investigators here who've written a lot of grants in their lifetimes, including Dr. Chandra and Dr. Eder and myself. I have a few slides in terms of sharing maybe some high-level thoughts, but before I go into that, I just want to see if Dr. Chandra or Eder have other tips or suggestions.
I also have a few slides, but I think we're running out of time. So I mean, I'm happy to share my slides later on. Please go ahead, Wilson.
We have booked for 1 hour and 30, so you can stay for as long and for as much as you can. I know time-wise always an issue, but Wilson, please.
Great, yeah, thank you. And I think, yeah, hopefully we'll have enough time where we can share slides afterwards with the attendees. But just by way of introduction, my name is Wilson Liao. I'm a professor of dermatology at UCSF. I currently work with Dr. Eder as co-chair of the GRAPPA Research Committee. So our committee is the one that evaluates all the GRAPPA pilot research grants that come in. And it's exciting to really see great proposals come in year after year. I think the proposals are getting stronger and stronger. So it's great to see the enthusiasm for the psoriatic disease community. Let me see if I can share my slides here. All right. So I just put together a quick top 8 tips for a successful grant application. And I think, really today the focus is probably more on the pilot grants or early career stage grants. Of course, there's many different types of grants. And so please keep that in mind as well. So just in terms of like the big picture, the big overview, I think from a reviewer standpoint, a successful grant weaves together the following different criteria, which is one, it really fits the grant mechanism, meaning it fits the what the grant is asking for in terms of what it's trying to fund. It's a proposal that funds a feasible yet innovative research project. There should be a strong applicant and research team. Nowadays it's not just about one individual, but about a team of collaborators. Um, as a younger faculty member or trainee, you do want to show you have the backing of your institution. And you also want to show how that, if you're successful in getting this grant, how that's going to put you one step further in your trajectory towards independence. So starting at the beginning, tip number one is really understanding the grant mechanism. So, as was mentioned, when you read the grant instructions, you want to understand, is this a pilot grant or is this a full research grant? Is it mentored with a mentor who's helping you, or is it independent? And then in terms of feasibility, as Steve and Dylan mentioned, you want to understand, am I supposed to accomplish everything in 1 year, 2 years, or 5 years? That's going to make a big difference in terms of what you're able to propose. A lot of times when we get applications that come in, we might find that applicants might not be actually eligible for the grant. A lot of times this comes in where it says, you're eligible if you're within like 10 years of your terminal degree, but people have kind of various paths and they get degrees at different times. So sometimes it's a little unclear like whether you would be eligible for a particular grant. So in that case, it's totally recommended just email the funding agency and just explain your situation, and they'll get back to you as to whether you're eligible. You don't want to spend a lot of time writing a grant if at the end of the day you're not eligible. And then it's very important to understand, I think, who is going to be reviewing the grant. Is it going to be going to psoriatic arthritis specialists who are extremely familiar with the details of psoriatic disease? Or is it going to maybe general researchers who are not as familiar with psoriatic disease? Or is it going to be a mix? So you want to write the grant towards the level of the reviewer, depending on who will be reviewing the grant. Tip number two is really to form that strong research team. It really helps and provides confidence to the reviewers if you're working with a mentor who is very well known in the field and who has a track record in the area that you're proposing. And you might ask, well, what happens if I'm working in an institution where my mentor maybe isn't as well known in that area? In that case, I would recommend reaching out to someone who is at a different institution and having that other person be your co-mentor, right? So your primary mentor can be the person that you work with day to day at your institution, but you can get feedback on your proposal from maybe someone who's a little bit more well known at a different institution. And then you want to build your co-mentor and co-investigator team. So you want to fill in your skill gaps, right? So let's say you're a PhD scientist and you don't have as much clinical knowledge or exposure, then it would be important for you to maybe have a co-mentor or co-investigator who is a clinician, who does understand the details about clinical research. If you are primarily wet lab, but you're doing a technique that involves a lot of computational biology, then you want to bring in a collaborator who is a bioinformatician or who's a statistician who can bring that skill set, right? If you're proposing a new technique, let's say IMC or spatial transcriptomics, and you've never done that before, it's going to be hard for the reviewers to feel confident that you can do that unless you have someone on your team with some experience in that area. So technical expertise in terms of carrying out that assay. And of course, most programs these days emphasize the importance of patient research partners. So reach out early. If you don't know a patient research partner, you can reach out to the funding agency to get you in touch with the PRP. And then if it's more a kind of a training grant, maybe it's like a 2-year grant where you're going to be mentoring as a heavy component, then it's very helpful and very impressive to reviewers to form an advisory committee where you have maybe people who aren't necessarily directly involved in the project, but who are knowledgeable in that area, who can meet with you twice a year to give you feedback on how your project is going. So consider an advisory committee. Tip number 3 is really to refine the project aims. I think Stephen showed a screenshot of all the different drafts of the application that he was working on. Two parts to that. One is really to do your due diligence, perform a really good literature search on your topic to see if it's already been done before, or what if it hasn't been done, what are the gaps, and what would be significant and novel about your proposal. But probably besides doing that, which everyone should do, the quickest way to really refine your project aims is really to talk to your mentor, because they're going to have the experience and knowledge to be able to know what the cutting edge is and what has already been done. And so they're going to very quickly be able to tell you, oh, that's not a good idea because it's not novel, or someone's already done that somewhere else, or here, this is a better way to go. So instead of struggling by yourself in terms of coming up with your ideas, start early in talking with your mentors about the idea as well as the feasibility. I would say probably the biggest thing that the review committee has issues with is feasibility, because pilot grants are very short, they're 1 year, and many proposals come in that say we're going to enroll 500 patients in a year and do full clinical evaluation and imaging and all these different things. You're like, oh my gosh, how are you going to enroll 500 patients in a year? So again, talk to your mentor about what's feasible in terms of the time frame of the grant. If the project is not already up and running, you have to consider, you've got to get the IRB approval. It's going to take a couple of months. So really think about all the practical steps necessary. Ideally, the grants that reviewers love the most is the ones where the patients are already enrolled. A lot of times there will be these big registries or pre-existing studies where perhaps there's already a cohort available that you can draw from, or the biosamples have already been collected, or they're very close to being collected. So the closer you are to having all the enrollment and the collection done, the better from a reviewer standpoint. And then finally, I think Stephen also mentioned the dependency of the aims. If aim 1 is to enroll 500 patients, and then aim 2 is to analyze the data from the 500 patients, if you aren't able to enroll 500 patients, then you can't do step 2, right? So think about strategies where if one aim is not successful, there's a way you can still get something out of the second aim. The next tip I have is really to prepare the different sections of the application. I think Stephen went through this really well already, so I won't go too much into it. I'll just, in terms of the approach and the methods, which I think is probably one of the biggest pitfalls for applicants, I do think it's really, really important, if you can, to show preliminary data. If it's a pilot grant and you really cannot show preliminary data, at least have someone on your team who has done something similar in that area before to give the reviewers confidence that you can actually do the work. We've already talked about sample size, power calculations. Also consider confounders or covariates. A lot of times in these clinical applications, you will be studying some aspect of the patients, but people will forget to include the effect of medications on the outcome, right? If the patients are currently on biologics or other therapies, like how is that taken into account? So it shows that you're very thoughtful if you can consider confounders and covariates. Tip number 5, I think, is to develop a realistic budget. Usually the budget is divided between the supplies to conduct the study and the salary efforts. It does look a little bit weird to the reviewers if everything is in one bucket. So if everything is for salary and there's no funding for the supplies for conducting the study, then the reviewers are like, oh, well, how are they going to actually fund the work? Conversely, if everything is for the budget and there's nothing for effort, then the reviewers might be, oh, well, how does the trainee have time to actually to do the work? So you want to try to balance the two realistically. Talk to your mentor for advice. Definitely justify the components of your budget. So if you're going to be doing an assay, you would write like, oh, I have 20 patients in the study, $500 per assay, so that's a total of $10,000. So kind of show it out in terms of how you arrive at that number. And to be honest, a lot of times these pilot grants can't necessarily cover the entire cost of the study, right? A pilot grant might be $40,000, $50,000. The study might cost $80,000. And so in that case, either in the mentor's letter or somewhere in the budget, you can just describe where the remainder is going to be made up from. My mentor will cover the rest, have that in the mentor letter, or kind of describe that in the budget. Another flag for reviewers is when they're looking at your CV, they may read another funded study with the exact same title or a very similar title to what you're applying for. So the reviewer might ask, well, it sounds like they've already been funded for this study. How will this set of funds be different, right? And so you want to explain any budgetary overlap or say this is a different study because A, B, and C. So just be aware of things that you've been funded for previously and how that might overlap with what you're currently proposing. Number 6, I actually think a lot of grant evaluation is in the detail in the letter of support. There's kind of no worse thing than having to read a mentor letter that is like one paragraph that just says so and so is an excellent student. I think they'll do a good job in their project. They have my support, signature. That is not what you want from the mentor letter. You want a detailed letter explaining how they know you, explaining your background in terms of your trajectory, giving support for the project that's been proposed, and then describing how this funding is really going to advance your career as the mentee, right? So you want a lot of detail in that mentor letter. You can help your mentor out by providing some bullet points that you think that could be incorporated in the mentor letter. So keep that in mind. Mentor letter is very important. We talked about the collaborators, and you want to have your collaborators write short letters in terms of that special complementary skill set that they'll be providing. And then finally, you want that strong institutional letter from your department chair or your dean. Again, not just saying that they have your support, but saying something nice, something supportive that you are a very promising trainee that we think can develop into an outstanding faculty member, something very positive. And as mentioned, it's hard to do all these things if you're scrambling in just 3 weeks to write a grant. So start early. I would recommend 2 to 3 months before the due date, and then give your letter writers 1 to 2 months to put together those letters, and then have that full draft ready at least a month before submission, and then circulate it to your mentor and your co-mentors. And then, yeah, just as mentioned, this is a learning process. Learn from the reviewer comments. Grant writing is not something any of us are born with. It's a skill that can be honed and improved over time with feedback. Review the grant comments from your mentor, and don't be discouraged. Even now, the most seasoned grant writers, the rate of success is 33%, 20%. So the majority of grants being written these days are not being funded just because of the tight funding situation. So don't be discouraged. Always seek to get feedback and just improve. So with that, I'll just pause, and I'll have Dr. Chandran and Eder add their comments as well.
So yeah, I have a few slides as well, just to summarize maybe a few points and highlight a few points. I don't know if you have anything before that.
No, it said go ahead with the slides. I think that'll be nice. Then we can have a discussion after.
Are you able to see? No.
No, you just close them.
Just like, okay.
Yes, now, yeah.
So I think, so just by way of introduction, I'm a rheumatologist and a clinician scientist, an associate professor at the University of Toronto. I've given this talk a couple of times for other purposes, not for the GRAPPA grant. So some of the tips, I think it's generally they would apply to any grant that you will think of in the future, and could be useful for you to apply. I think the other point I wanted to make is that I guess, okay, well, there will be some repetition here, but I think repetition is not necessarily a bad thing, also for grants. So these are, I think, in my opinion, the key things that I would like to emphasize. And of course, whatever was mentioned before, I think is really excellent. And if you could put something together that as a resource, that would be great. Just going back to the research question, I think this is critical. This is, for me as a reviewer, what immediately captures my attention, and for my opinion on a grant, and trying to think, as other people mentioned, what is the key research question? What are you trying to achieve in this grant? And what are the key gaps in knowledge or in care that this grant is going to fill? Now, just saying there is limited information on whatever is not sufficient, because just having limited information on a topic and that you're interested in is not necessarily a reason that is good enough to convince a reviewer to give you money to do this study. So just the academic interest is not enough. I think it really had to be tied into a more tangible aim. If it's clinical research, it may be a little bit easier. If it's more translational and basic, it might be a little bit more complex, but I think ultimately you want to make things very clear why you should be getting the money for your research. So for example, if this is a completely novel thing, then it might be a bit easier because nobody has done it before or investigated it before. So you kind of need to think about, why is this topic, how is this the results of your study going to improve medicine or patient care or understanding, and why is this important? Having said that, it's still okay to do studies on topics that have been investigated before, but I think here you need to be thinking a little bit more about how your approach to this research is novel compared to what other people were doing. Maybe you're recruiting more, you have a bigger data set, maybe you have a new method to evaluate things that is going to be more accurate than what people have used before. Maybe previous studies were flawed in different ways, and you want to highlight it, that you're going to do a study that is much better than what other people have done before. And then why should people care is really what will convince reviewers and others that this is really a critical topic to study. And the way this is probably where I spend most of my time when I try to think about grant and try to criticize it in my mind and think as a reviewer, why is this important? And this is how I build my introduction. So the introduction really has to capture the attention of the reviewer, and the books that Stephen was giving as an example, especially the one from regarding the hook, is really, I think, is what helped me to form these 1 or 2 sentences to convince a reviewer that this is important, and then repeating it again and again throughout the grant is also a good thing. The second point is ask for help. I think what helped me at the beginning of when I started writing grants is looking at successful grant proposals from colleagues, especially if it's the same field. So if you're doing clinical research, applications from clinical researchers, I think it's very clear when you read a good proposal that trying to understand the structures, and what Stephen showed, I think, are really some important points. And having the grant reviewed by non-experts, so these are people that are not necessarily from the PSA field and can maybe help you clarify things. I think this is more relevant maybe to applications outside of the GRAPPA grant competition, where everyone are sort of experts, but in if these are applications, for example, to national agencies, people that review your grants are not necessarily within the same field. So thinking about simplifying some of these terms and making things that seem to you very important and clear making it clear to someone who is not necessarily the most expert in the particular field that you're studying. Editing, I think, is important. As also Stephen mentioned, I also usually write a grant. I don't think so much about the format, so the first versions are very long, and then I start to cut out parts of it. I don't know how many people here are not native English speakers like me, but at the beginning this is can be hard, and I would still suggest that you write in your own language, but use either editing services or now ChatGPT to help you edit things, not write instead of you. But making sure that this is that you don't have an application that is have typos or weird grammatical sentences. Making your grant readable. So many of the reviewers would read your grants during flights or travels and late in night, so making it easier for them. So first, highlight important sections, include white spaces, so between the paragraph, don't make it very condensed that it's so hard to read. This is really annoying as a reviewer to see. And the other point is that your grant proposal is not a study protocol. So I know, again, with the GRAPPA, you have a very tight word limit or page limit. But even if you have more, it's really more describing concepts and having enough details about the study design and justification of selection of certain methods, rather than being a protocol that someone has to follow, especially in a lab, a protocol or something else. This is really about more concepts. Yes, you do need to have details, but it's the balance between having just a general idea of what you're going to be doing, as opposed to something that's a protocol that someone needs to follow in order to complete this study. I talked about repetition, so I try to repeat key concepts, especially if I have, cool tool or method or design or a novel thing that the study is going to accomplish several times throughout the grant, because you really want to highlight for the reviewer what is so important, why is your study so great that someone would want to give you money. So this repetition in the introduction, in the aim, during the methods, and in the summary would definitely stick with them once they come to score your grant. The other point is becoming familiar with the review process. So reading carefully the instructions. If this is a pilot grant as GRAPPA, it should be a pilot rather than a 5-year grant proposal. If you do have, this is true for GRAPPA, but for other applications, how these grants are going to be scored. So each application is scoring the grants and the sections differently. Some is putting more emphasis on more high risk, innovative ideas, and others are more kind of conventional. So it's important to pay attention for that. I don't know, in depending on your country, in Canada, the CIHR is like the NIH. It has the reviewer training program, and for me, it was very, very helpful to see how grants are being reviewed. And I know GRAPPA is not really the same, being a relatively smaller organization, but if you do have a chance to be a reviewer in a granting agency, even a small one, I think it's also helpful to see it from the other side. And review grants for organizations in your field. So if you're being asked to be a reviewer, I think it's highly recommended to give back to the community, but also it's a learning process. And people said that be resilient. It's hard. Most of the grants are not being funded, so keep trying. and good luck.
I just want to say that so far, everything has been amazing presentations. I am learning a lot, making notes of my own here. And as he said in the beginning, repetition is not always bad. Actually, I find repetition is usually good, especially in these cases. But without taking much of the time, I'll give the mic to Vinod if he wants to make any remarks.
Not really. Both Wilson and Lee has really made it really clear on the strategies. I think as you keep doing this, you get better at it. So practice makes perfect. Um, my tips would be, always start early. Definitely 6. Like we're all, stressed for time. There's so many other things that we need to do, but getting that time, protected time to do this work, and start 12 weeks in advance. By 6 to 4 weeks from the deadline, you should have most of it ready. I say this, but looking at on my own uh, track record, it's like it's almost the I'm still working on it the last minute, right? But the recommendation is that you try to have all the uh, things in place well in advance. And important thing is to write every day so that you get into the habit of writing, and then you have a um, person, could be a spouse, could be a friend who's not in your area, who knows the details of it, but in this area of science, who can review it and tell you this doesn't make sense, or make it simple, or because once we start writing and reading it every day, what happens is that we think it's perfect, right? It's but and if you take a gap and come back, maybe it's better, but we don't have that time. So uh, first draft is very dirty. Don't worry too much about the page limits, etc. And then as you refine it, and then you start bringing it down, um, and then you get there. The budget, some Wilson mentioned, is important. Most granting agencies say the budget should not impact the review of the proposal, but it usually does because it, feasibility and how you're actually getting to do it is important. So it's important to mention it. Um, Most granting agencies have specific requirements, so spend enough time to go to the granting agencies, read the requirements, both what should be there in each section, the formatting, etc. GRAPPA is very, I think generally very not very strict about it, but some agency will simply reject your grant because your format was, the font size was this much and the margin should have been this much, and you were slightly off and you're out, right? So those things should be. If you have an admin assistant to help you, or if not, you yourself should really ensure that those things are in place. And then sometimes you're so engrossed in your proposal that you forget that you have an internal deadline, and then you submit it and they say, sorry, the internal deadline was 2 days ago. Can't sign off from your institution. So have those things already well in advance. So talk to your research institute and say, is there an early deadline that you need? Sometimes they say, okay, they don't need a final draft, but a final, polished one, but a draft is fine because many of the institutions would like to review the grant to ensure that they follows they might have a strategic plan or some guidelines on what grant they want to support, and so you need the sign off from the signing authorities because the money obviously is going to the institution and not to you. So those are the things that we sometimes forget. Uh, in the we are so much invested in the science of it that these are the things which are really important, and try to keep it simple. The simpler the better. Even if it's the most complicated thing, write it very simply in a not lay but almost lay language, because the scientists involved probably have no idea of psoriatic disease or the single cell transcriptomics or the nitty-gritty of analysis of data from accelerometer, for example. So keep it simple.
I just want to echo something that Vinod and Lee mentioned, which is reviewers might be reviewing it on an airplane or at odd hours. And the way you can make it very readable is to, let's say you read the grant instructions like for GRAPPA, and it says, this grant will be scored on significance, innovation, and feasibility. What you can actually do is highlight that word in your grant. This grant is innovative, highlight innovative because, and then put the reason. This grant is significant because we feel this is feasible because, and so it's like the grant reviewers are looking for these different boxes, and if you just highlight the box they can look at, it just makes it so much easier for the grant reviewer to score. Oh, okay, yeah, check, check, check. It's good, right? So don't make the grant reviewer hunt all over. Where is this? Where is that? Just kind of lay it all out for them according to the criteria.
This has all been very enriching learning experience. If anyone would like to make any last remarks or questions before we end the session.
So the big question nowadays is, oh, what about AI? How can you use AI to? So some granting agency clearly would mention, they have these tools to see how
True.
much of AI you've used. So if they say you're not supposed to use AI, then don't use AI because you might get penalized for it. But in my own, use it properly. Don't you can use Copilot and other things to polish it. You can these tools can help you make it simpler, but don't use it blindly, right? One thing about grant writing is like when you're actually writing it, typing it, you're actually thinking, and that's a process, that's a skill. And yes, the first draft takes like 3 weeks, and the second, but as you're writing, you're thinking, and you're like, wait a minute, you go and do a research, you go back, you more qualify it, you look for references. So that's a deliberate thinking process. When you use tools at the moment, what is available, you're just not using that thinking part of your brain. You're just, the tool gives you, yeah, this is the summary of the literature from the last 5 years in transcriptomics in rheumatoid synovium, and it'll give you a summary, and you're like, oh, this is great, cut paste. What would have taken you 2 weeks is now done in 30 minutes. But then you're not read through it, you're not thought through it, you not understand the tools that you use to polish it may be okay, but spend your time and effort in actually writing the first draft, thinking through it, and because you are, the area and what you're interested in, and these tools are not going to be that great, and gradually you might lose your skill of thinking when you just use these things and try to save time.
In that regard, I just want to say one thing that goes along with what you mentioned before, and with something that he told me a while ago that I always kind of remember, that having protected time is important for pretty much any task you want to do. Writing a grant proposal is a very important and mind-challenging task, so you need to assert time for that. And I remember her saying, and she can correct me if I'm wrong, because she's right there, that for tasks such as writing a grant proposal, writing a project, those tasks you need to be at your best, having like most of your mind up your game. So your creative time, when your mind is well rested, that's when you should be doing those things instead of tired at night, squeezed between arriving at home and dinner. So I think it aligns well with that.
Yeah, I thank you for listening.
I always do.
Yeah, I for me, definitely, I would agree with that. I block time in my calendar that nobody would book any meetings for me, and this has to be especially for the initial draft and initial writing, I do need a lot of time. So this is something that I don't think, at least for me, I cannot do it in between tasks and phones and meetings. I need blocked half a day or full day to sit down and write it down and think about it. And as other people said, do some research and all of these things. So that's, but I should say that it's actually, for me, it's a fun time, because I kind of think, oh, I'm convincing myself this is the best research ever, trying to convince other reviewers or researchers that, so this is kind of a creative ways, but also, I mean, optimistic, trying to convince other people this is going to be great. So I'm usually, these are good times, and once you get the results and the reality, or you need to carry out the research itself, then you run into trouble. It's a little bit, I think, less happy.
The challenge, of course, is protected time means somebody has to pay for that time. As a trainee, your supervisor will, so that's a great time to get all these skills up. When you become faculty, many places don't have protected time, so that's a challenge. Other thing for clinician researchers is that although we have the clinical context and you understand the disease, the patient perspective, etc., compared to a basic scientist, the basic scientists have a advantage in the sense that they're mostly doing research all the time, so they got more time on writing their research proposals and working on the experiments, whereas as a clinician, you have to juggle between clinical and other responsibilities. And but for example, in the CIHR, you're on the same panel with them, so there is always, as a clinician scientist or researcher, you really have to be, put that extra effort in, and so it's a challenge, but it's fun.
Well, I guess here is a good time for us to end this webinar with the quote unquote. It's a challenge, but it can be fun. Thanks for everyone that attended. Thanks, Stephen and Dylan, for showing their recent experiences with successful grant applications, and for Vinod, Lihi, and Wilson to really walk us through their way of doing things. I think it was very enriching, and for those that want, it will be available recorded afterwards, after we do some proofing on the website. Thank you, everyone.